Thomas smiled and nodded at the DJ. Yes, please. This is still a wedding. Still a celebration. Let's celebrate. The music started up again, something upbeat and happy, and slowly people began to move. But the energy in the room had completely transformed. Where before there had been a clear divide between the two sides, now people were mixing, talking, sharing stories. The bride's family members who had been sitting quietly were now being approached by guests from the groom's side. People wanting to introduce themselves properly, perhaps apologize for their earlier coldness. Margaret watched it all happen with a sense of wonder. Her Aunt Jennifer was talking animatedly with one of James's cousins, showing her photos on her phone. Her uncle was laughing with one of Richard's business associates, telling some story that had them both grinning. The walls had come down, or at least started to crumble. James pulled her onto the dance floor, and they swayed together while people clapped and cheered. I'm still processing all of this, he whispered in her ear. Your dad is incredible. I mean, I always knew he was amazing, but this... I know, Margaret said, resting her head on his shoulder. I'm in shock. Complete shock. All those years he never said a word. Never hinted. Just kept working, kept living simply, kept teaching me to be grateful for what I had. She pulled back to look at him. And you. What you said to your parents. That took courage. James shook his head. Not enough courage. I should have said it months ago. Years ago, even. I've watched them treat people badly my whole life, and I just accepted it as normal. But it's not normal. It's wrong. They danced in silence for a moment, and then James added quietly, I don't know if they'll really change. My parents. They apologized, but I'm not sure they fully understand what they did wrong. Maybe not, Margaret agreed, but at least it's a start. And at least now they know they can't treat people that way without consequences. Across the room, Victoria was sitting at her table, her makeup ruined, her perfect facade completely shattered. One of her friends had come over to comfort her, but Victoria had waved her away. She needed to think, needed to process what had just happened. She'd spent her entire adult life building a certain image. The perfect house, the perfect car, the perfect clothes, the right friends, the right clubs, the right everything. And she'd looked down on anyone who didn't meet her standards. It had made her feel superior, secure, important. But Thomas Chen had just destroyed that entire worldview in the span of 15 minutes. He'd shown her that all her assumptions were wrong, that the old man she'd mocked was actually more successful than she was, that her wealth, which she'd used as a measuring stick for human worth, was meaningless in the face of real character. It hurt. God, it hurt. But underneath the pain was something else, something that felt almost like relief, as if a heavy weight she'd been carrying her whole life had suddenly been lifted. Richard sat next to her, silent. He was feeling his own version of the same thing. His whole identity had been wrapped up in being successful, being important, being better than others. And now he'd been humiliated in front of everyone he knew. But there was also a small part of him, a part he didn't want to acknowledge, that felt something like respect for Thomas. The man had played a long game and played it brilliantly, had lived with discipline and purpose that Richard himself had never managed. On the dance floor, Thomas was now dancing with his daughter again. The DJ had put on another slow song, and Margaret was crying happy tears as her father held her. I'm so proud of you, Thomas said softly, not because you married into money or because you're going to have a beautiful house, but because you've stayed kind and humble and true to yourself despite everything. You taught me that, Margaret said. Everything good about me I learned from watching you. Thomas's eyes sparkled with tears. Then I succeeded. That's all a parent can hope for. To raise a child who's better than they are. When the song ended, Thomas made his way back to his seat. He was tired now, the evening's events catching up with him. But he was content. He'd done what he set out to do. He'd given his daughter security and opportunity. He'd taught everyone in that room a lesson they wouldn't forget. And maybe, just maybe, he'd help some people see the world a little differently. People started coming over to his table, not to mock him now, but to shake his hand, to thank him for his words, to ask him about his investment strategies and how he'd managed such incredible financial success. Thomas answered their questions patiently, graciously, never once being smug or superior despite having every right to be. Margaret's former teacher, Mrs. Patterson, sat down next to him with tears in her eyes. I always knew you were special, she said. The way you'd show up to every parent-teacher conference even after working all night. The way you'd volunteer for school events, help with fundraisers. You could have been resting, but you were always there for Margaret. Thomas smiled. She was worth every minute of lost sleep. As the night wore on, the party continued, but with a different tone. There was still dancing and laughter, but it felt more genuine now, more real. The performance aspect had fallen away, replaced by actual connection. James's best friend pulled him aside at one point. "Dude, your father-in-law just became a legend. That was the most incredible thing I've ever witnessed at a wedding." James laughed. "Tell me about it." "I married into the right family, that's for sure." Around 10 o'clock, Thomas decided it was time for him to leave. He was exhausted, and he'd said what he needed to say. Margaret walked him out to his car, the same old sedan he'd been driving for 15 years. "Dad," she said as they stood in the parking lot, "why are you still driving this car? You could afford anything you want." Thomas patted the hood affectionately. "Because it runs fine. Why would I get rid of something that still works perfectly well?" Margaret laughed through her tears. "You're never going to change, are you?" "Not in the ways that matter," he agreed. He pulled her into a hug. "I love you, sweetheart. Enjoy your beautiful wedding night. Enjoy your beautiful life. You deserve every bit of happiness that comes your way. I love you too, Dad, so much. Thank you for everything. Not just the house or the money, but for being you, for teaching me what really matters." After Thomas drove away, Margaret stood in the parking lot for a few minutes, just breathing in the cool night air. Her mind was still spinning from everything that had happened. She thought about her childhood, about all the times she'd wished they had more money. Wished her dad didn't have to work so hard. Wished they could afford nicer things, but now she understood. Her dad had been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. He'd been thinking decades ahead, building something that would last. And he'd done it all while teaching her the most important lessons of her life. When she went back inside, the party was still going strong. James found her immediately, pulling her close. "You okay?" he asked. "Better than okay," she said. "I'm perfect." They danced for hours more, surrounded by friends and family. The Montgomerys left relatively early, still processing their humiliation and hopefully their lessons. But most people stayed late, celebrating not just the wedding but something bigger. The triumph of character over pretense, the validation of hard work and humility, the reminder that you can never judge a book by its cover. 3 months later, Margaret and James moved into their new home in Riverside Heights. The house was even more beautiful than the photos had shown. Bright and spacious with big windows that let in floods of natural light, a kitchen with modern appliances and granite countertops, a backyard with a deck perfect for entertaining. They spent the first few weeks furnishing it, choosing pieces together, making it their own. Margaret insisted they keep things relatively simple. She didn't want to become the kind of person who filled their house with expensive things just to show off. Her father's lessons had stuck. The first guest they invited over was Thomas, of course. He arrived in his old car, still wearing his modest clothes, still walking with his cane. Margaret showed him around proudly, and he smiled at everything, clearly delighted to see her so happy. "It's perfect," he said when the tour was complete. "This is everything I hoped for you." They sat in the living room, drinking coffee, and Thomas told them more stories about his investing journey. About the mistakes he'd made early on, about the lessons he'd learned, about the patience and discipline it had required. The hardest part wasn't the saving, he admitted. It was watching other people spend money on things I knew I could afford but chose not to buy. Watching them take vacations while I kept working. Watching them drive new cars while I drove my old one. But I kept my eyes on the goal. "On your future," James, who'd been listening intently, asked, "Do you have any regrets? About how you lived? About not enjoying your money while you were younger?" Thomas thought about it for a moment. "No," he finally said, "because I was enjoying it. Maybe not in the way most people do, but I got satisfaction from watching my investments grow, from knowing I was building something meaningful, and I got to see Margaret grow up to be an amazing person. That was worth more than any vacation or fancy car." He smiled at them both. "Besides, I'm still here, still healthy enough to enjoy life, and now I get to see you two in this beautiful home, starting your lives together. That's the real payoff." Before Thomas left that day, Margaret asked him to help her hang something. They went to the entryway, and she pulled out a framed photograph she'd had made. It showed Thomas in his janitor's uniform, taken about 10 years earlier. He was standing in an office building, mop in hand, but he was smiling at the camera with that gentle, knowing smile of his. Beneath the photo, Margaret had added a plaque with an engraving. Thomas put on his reading glasses to see what it said. Real wealth is measured in character, not currency. Thomas's eyes filled with tears. He reached out and touched the frame gently. That's beautiful, sweetheart. It's true, Margaret said firmly. And I never want to forget it. Every time someone comes to this house, I want them to see this photo. I want them to know where I came from and what really matters. They hung it together right by the front door where everyone who entered would see it. And it stayed there for decades, a reminder and a lesson that continued to teach long after that memorable wedding night. The story of Thomas Chen and his incredible wedding gift spread through the city. People talked about it for years. It became the kind of story people told at dinner parties, a modern parable about assumptions and appearances and the true meaning of success. Victoria and Richard Montgomery did change, though slowly and imperfectly. They never became completely different people, but they became more aware, more careful, less quick to judge. They made an effort with Margaret's family, though it was sometimes awkward. But they tried, and that counted for something. James and Margaret built a beautiful life together in that house. They had children eventually, and Thomas got to be a grandfather, spoiling his grandkids in modest ways but teaching them the same lessons he'd taught their mother. About hard work, about humility, about character. And sometimes when those grandchildren would ask why they lived in such a nice house but their grandpa drove such an old car and wore such simple clothes, Margaret would tell them the story, about the janitor who became a millionaire, about the wedding gift that stunned everyone, about the lesson that changed not just one family but an entire community. Your grandpa, she would tell them, is the richest person I know, not because of what he has in the bank, but because of what he has in his heart. And the children would nod, maybe not fully understanding yet, but knowing that it was important, that there was wisdom in those words they'd need someday. Thomas lived to be 93 years old. He kept working until he was 85, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. He spent his final years surrounded by family, comfortable and content, knowing he'd done what he set out to do. He'd raised a daughter well. He'd lived according to his values. And he'd left a legacy that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with how to be a good person in this world. At his funeral, the church was packed, not just with family, but with people whose lives he'd touched over the decades, former coworkers, people he'd helped along the way, and yes, even some people from the groom's side of that wedding, who'd learned something important that night and never forgotten it. Margaret gave the eulogy, standing at the podium with tears streaming down her face but her voice strong and clear. My father was a janitor, she began, and he was also one of the wisest, most disciplined, most successful people I've ever known. He taught me that your job doesn't define you. Your bank account doesn't define you. Your possessions don't define you. What defines you is how you treat people, how you live your values, how you sacrifice for the ones you love. She looked out at the crowd. He gave me many gifts in his life. A beautiful home, financial security, opportunity. But the greatest gift was the example he set, the lesson he taught not just me, but everyone he met. That true wealth, real success is measured in character. And by that measure, my father was the richest man I ever knew. The service ended with everyone standing to applaud. Not a typical funeral response, but then Thomas Chen had not been a typical man. He'd been extraordinary in quiet ways that most people never saw. Until one wedding night when he decided to let everyone see, and in doing so, changed more lives than he'd ever know. The weight of Thomas's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. James felt them settle on his shoulders, and the truth stung worse than he wanted to admit. He hadn't stood up to his parents. Not really. Sure, he'd argued with them in private, told them they were being unfair, asked them to be nicer to Margaret and her family. But when it came down to it, when they were being cruel in public, he'd stayed silent. He'd let them humiliate the woman he loved and her father, all because he was too afraid to make waves. I'm sorry, James said, his voice cracking. He wasn't just talking to Thomas anymore. He was looking at Margaret, tears streaming down his face. I'm so sorry. I should have said something. I should have defended you both. I was a coward. Margaret reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. She was crying too, but she understood. It was hard to stand up to your own parents. Hard to choose between the person you loved and the people who raised you. But Thomas wasn't finished. He stood up slowly, using his cane for support, and addressed the room. His voice was stronger now, filled with a quiet authority that made everyone lean in to listen. "I've spent my entire life being invisible," he said. "Being overlooked. Being dismissed because of what I did for a living or where I came from. And you know what I learned? The people who judge you based on your job title or your bank account are usually the ones who have nothing else to offer the world." Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular, but everyone knew who he was talking about. "I've cleaned toilets that Victoria Montgomery used," Thomas continued, his tone conversational but pointed. "I've vacuumed the floors of Richard's office building. I've emptied the trash cans of people just like them for 50 years. And while I was doing that humble work, providing for my daughter, building a future for her, they were looking down on me." Victoria's face had gone from white to bright red. She looked like she wanted to sink through the floor. Richard was staring at his plate, his jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscles jumping. "But here's the thing," Thomas said. And now his voice carried something else. Not anger exactly, but a deep, profound sadness. "I never asked for their respect. I never needed their approval. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew that my worth wasn't determined by their opinion of me, and I knew that someday, somehow, the truth would come out." He turned to Margaret, his expression softening. "I didn't buy you this house to show off or to prove anything to people like the Montgomerys. I bought it because you deserve it. Because you've worked hard your whole life, too. Because you've been kind and good and honest, and those qualities are worth more than any amount of money." Margaret stood and walked over to her father, wrapping her arms around him. They held each other while everyone watched, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Even some of the people from the Groom side were wiping their faces, moved despite themselves. When they finally pulled apart, Thomas reached into his folder one more time. "There's more," he said. "The house is just part of it." He handed Margaret another document. This one was even more official looking, with multiple pages stapled together. Margaret's hands were still shaking as she read it, and her eyes went wide. "This is a trust fund," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, this says $500,000, Thomas confirmed. "For your future. For emergencies, for opportunities, for whatever you and James need to build your life together. It's been sitting in a trust for the past 10 years, growing, waiting for this moment." James had to sit down. His legs literally gave out and he dropped into the nearest chair. "Sir, we can't accept this. It's too much." "You can and you will," Thomas said firmly. "I didn't spend 50 years building this wealth just to take it to my grave. What good is money if you can't use it to help the people you love?" He looked around the room, making eye contact with various guests. That's what wealth is supposed to be for. Not for showing off or making other people feel small. Not for buying fancy things you don't need just to impress people you don't like. It's for security. For opportunity. For giving your children a better life than you had. The Montgomerys looked like they'd been hit by a truck. Their entire worldview had just been turned upside down. The old janitor they'd mocked, the man they'd treated as less than human, was wealthier than they were. And he'd done it through discipline, intelligence, and decades of patient, careful planning. But Thomas wasn't done. He turned to face Richard and Victoria directly, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "I want to thank you both." That surprised everyone, including the Montgomerys themselves. Victoria's head snapped up, confusion written all over her face. "Thank us?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "For what?" "For showing my daughter exactly what kind of people she doesn't want to become," Thomas said. "For teaching her through your example that money without character is worthless. That status without substance is empty. That looking down on others says far more about you than it does about them." The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't a cruel statement, not exactly. Thomas had delivered it with an almost clinical precision, stating facts rather than hurling insults. But the truth of his words hit harder than any insult could have. Richard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I think we've heard enough of this circus," he said, trying to regain some dignity. "Victoria, we're leaving." But Victoria wasn't moving. She was staring at Thomas with an expression that was hard to read. Shame, maybe, or realization, or just pure shock at how wrong she'd been. "You stayed," she finally said, her voice small. "You kept working as a janitor even after you had money. Why?" Thomas tilted his head, considering the question. Because I liked my job. Because the people I worked with were good people who treated me with respect. Because I knew that the moment I stopped working, started living off my investments, I'd become someone different, someone I didn't want to be. He paused, then added, and because I wanted to teach my daughter that there's no shame in honest work, that a job doesn't define your worth as a person, that you can push a mop and still be intelligent, still be successful, still be valuable. James stood up and walked over to Thomas. He extended his hand, and when Thomas took it, James pulled him into a hug. "Thank you," he said, his voice muffled against the older man's shoulder. "Thank you for this incredible gift. But more than that, thank you for the lesson. I needed to hear it." We all did. When they pulled apart, James turned to his parents. His face was set in a way Margaret had never seen before, determined, almost angry. "I think you both owe Thomas an apology," he said clearly, "and Margaret. And actually, everyone in this room that you've talked down to tonight." Richard's face turned purple. "Apologize for what?" "We didn't know exactly," James interrupted. "You didn't know. You made assumptions based on appearances. You treated a good man like garbage because he wore an old suit and walked with a cane, and you did it at my wedding in front of everyone I care about." Victoria was crying now, her expensive makeup running down her face. "James, please, you were just being yourselves," James said, and the sadness in his voice was unmistakable. "That's the problem, Mom. This is who you are, who you've always been, and I'm ashamed that it took this moment for me to really see it." He took Margaret's hand and pulled her close. "I love you both. You're my parents, and I'll always love you. But I won't let you treat my wife or her family this way anymore. If you can't respect them, if you can't apologize and mean it, then we're going to have a very different relationship going forward." The ballroom had gone completely silent again. This was family drama playing out in front of 100 witnesses, and nobody knew quite where to look. Victoria broke first. She walked slowly toward Thomas, her heels clicking on the floor. When she reached him, she stood there for a long moment, and then, to everyone's surprise, she spoke. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "You're right. All of you are right. I've been horrible. We both have been." She looked back at Richard, who still stood frozen by their table. "I spent this whole night looking down on you and your family, and now I find out that you're—" She trailed off, seeming to struggle for words. "Human?" Thomas suggested gently. "Just a person like everyone else? Someone who worked hard and loved his daughter and tried to do right by her?" Victoria nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know if you can forgive me. I'm not sure I deserve it, but I am truly, genuinely sorry." Thomas studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I accept your apology. We all make mistakes. The question is whether we learn from them." Richard still hadn't moved. James walked over to him, and father and son stood face to face. "Dad," James said quietly. "Your turn." Richard's mouth opened and closed several times. You could see the war happening inside him. Pride versus shame. Ego versus reality. His whole identity had been built on the idea that he was better than others, that his success made him superior. And now that foundation was crumbling. Finally, he walked over to Thomas. He didn't hug him, didn't even offer his hand. But he looked the older man in the eye and said, "I was wrong. About you, about a lot of things. I apologize. It wasn't a great apology. It wasn't warm or emotional or particularly sincere sounding. But it was something. A start, maybe." Thomas nodded. "Accepted." The tension in the room began to ease slightly. People started talking again in low voices, processing what they'd just witnessed. Some guests from the groom's side looked uncomfortable, probably wondering if they'd been guilty of the same kind of judgment. Others looked thoughtful, like they were reevaluating their own assumptions about success and worth. Margaret stood between her father and her new husband, holding both their hands. She felt like she was in some kind of dream. Her father, the man who'd packed her lunches in paper bags and darned his own socks to save money, was a multi-millionaire. He'd given her a house worth more than most people would earn in their entire lifetimes, and he'd done it all in secret, sacrificing his own comfort to teach her values that money couldn't buy. "I still can't believe this," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Dad, I've been worried about you for years. Worried about whether you had enough money for retirement, whether you could afford your medications, whether you'd be okay as you got older." Thomas smiled. "I know, sweetheart. And I'm sorry for making you worry, but I wanted you to stay grounded. I wanted you to focus on building your own life, your own success, rather than waiting for an inheritance. He squeezed her hand. Besides, I'm not done yet. I'm still working, still investing, still planning. And when I do retire, I'll be just fine. Better than fine. The DJ, who'd been standing awkwardly to the side during all of this, cleared his throat. Should we continue with the party? Everyone looked at each other, and then, surprisingly, they started laughing. The tension broke like a dam bursting, and suddenly the room was filled with the sound of relieved, almost hysterical laughter. Thomas stood slowly, gripping his cane with one hand. The room had gone quiet, but not in a respectful way. It was the kind of silence that comes before people expect to be entertained by someone else's inadequacy. Margaret could see it in their faces, especially on the groom's side. They were waiting to see what the old janitor could possibly offer that would matter. Her father looked smaller somehow, standing there in his worn suit under the bright lights of the ballroom. His shoulders were slightly hunched from years of bending over mops and cleaning equipment. His hands wrapped around that wooden cane were wrinkled and marked with age spots. To everyone watching, he probably looked exactly like what they thought he was, an old man who'd worked a humble job his whole life and had nothing to show for it. Victoria's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "This should be precious," she said to the woman next to her, not even bothering to lower her voice. "I wonder if he's regifting something." More snickers from the groom's side. Margaret felt James tense beside her, his jaw clenched so tight she worried he might crack a tooth. But he didn't say anything. He never did when it came to his parents. Thomas reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. His hands were shaking slightly, and Margaret's heart broke watching him. She wanted to run over there and hug him and tell everyone in this room exactly what she thought of them, but something in her father's eyes stopped her. There was a calmness there, an assurance that she didn't understand. He pulled out a simple white envelope. Nothing fancy, no embossed lettering or expensive paper, just a regular envelope that you could buy at any drugstore. Compared to the elaborate presentation the Montgomerys had made, it looked almost pathetic. "Oh, Lord," Richard muttered, loudly enough that half the room heard him. An envelope. How original. More laughter, though some people were starting to look uncomfortable now. A few guests from the bride's side looked angry, their faces red with suppressed fury at how Thomas was being treated. But they stayed quiet, not wanting to cause a scene at the wedding. Thomas made his way slowly across the dance floor toward where Margaret and James stood. Each step was deliberate, the tap of his cane echoing in the silent room. It felt like it took forever. Margaret watched her father approach, tears already streaming down her face. She was so angry and so heartbroken and so full of love for this man who'd given her everything. When he reached them, Thomas looked at James first. Really looked at him, in a way that made the younger man stand up straighter. "Take care of my daughter," Thomas said quietly. "That's all I ask." "I will, sir," James promised, his voice thick with emotion. "I swear I will." Then Thomas turned to Margaret and handed her the envelope. His eyes were wet, but he was smiling. That same gentle smile he'd given her on her first day of school, at her high school graduation when she told him she was getting married. A smile that said everything would be okay, even when it felt like it wouldn't. "Open it, sweetheart," he said softly. Margaret's hands were shaking as she took the envelope. It was heavier than she expected. She glanced at James, who nodded encouragingly, then carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, official-looking with a fancy header and a lot of legal text. Margaret's eyes scanned it once, not understanding. Then again, more slowly. Then her hand started shaking so badly that James had to grab her arm to steady her. "What is it?" he asked, concerned. "Margaret, what's wrong?" She couldn't speak, couldn't form words. The paper trembled in her hands as she stared at it, reading the same lines over and over, convinced she was seeing things. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. James gently took the paper from her hands and began to read aloud, his voice uncertain at first. "This is a deed of property for a single-family home located at—" His voice trailed off. His face went pale. He looked up at Thomas with wide, disbelieving eyes. "This says Riverside Heights." A murmur ran through the crowd. Riverside Heights. Everyone knew that neighborhood. It was where the wealthiest families in the city lived, where houses started at $2 million and went up from there. "Way up, that can't be right," Richard said loudly, standing up from his chair. "There must be some mistake." Riverside Heights? That's impossible. But Thomas just smiled, reaching back into his jacket pocket. This time he pulled out a folder, and from it he produced several more documents. Property assessments, recent photographs, bank statements showing a completed transaction. It's the house 3 doors down from yours, Richard, Thomas said calmly, his voice carrying across the now completely silent ballroom. Number 42? The colonial with the blue shutters and the big oak tree in the front yard. I purchased it last month. Paid in full cash, you could have heard a pin drop. Every single person in that room was frozen, staring at Thomas like he'd just sprouted wings. Victoria's face had gone completely white, her mouth hanging open in a way that would have been comical if the moment wasn't so charged. "You're lying," she said, her voice shrill. "This is some kind of joke. Some kind of scam." Thomas pulled out more papers. "Here's the property assessment. The house was valued at $2.4 million. I paid $2.6 to ensure my offer was accepted immediately. Here's the closing statement. Here's the deed transfer, properly notarized and recorded with the county. And here," he held up his phone, "is the contact information for the real estate attorney who handled the transaction. You're welcome to call and verify." Margaret was crying so hard now that she could barely see. James was still holding the deed, his hands shaking, his face a mixture of shock and confusion and dawning understanding. "I don't understand," Margaret choked out. "Dad, how?" "You're a janitor. You've always been a janitor. We lived in that tiny apartment. You drove the same car for 20 years. How could you possibly—" Thomas's expression softened as he looked at his daughter. "Sit down, sweetheart. Both of you. Let me tell you a story." People started pulling chairs over, creating a small circle. The formal gift presentation had devolved into something else entirely. Everyone wanted to hear this. Even the Montgomerys were leaning in, though they still looked like they'd been slapped. Thomas settled himself carefully into a chair, setting his cane aside. He took a deep breath and began. "When your mother died, Margaret, you were only 5 years old. I was 28. I had a job cleaning offices in the financial district downtown. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest and it paid the bills." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "I worked the night shift from 11 at night until 7 in the morning. I'd drop you off at your aunt's house before work, then pick you up in the morning and take you to school. Sleep a few hours during the day while you were at school, then be there when you got home." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. She remembered those years. Remembered her dad always being tired but always making time for her. "The thing about cleaning offices in the financial district," Thomas continued, "is that you hear things. These big executives, they'd work late, have meetings in their offices while I was emptying their trash cans or vacuuming their floors. To them I was invisible, just part of the furniture, but I wasn't deaf." A knowing smile crossed his face. "I heard them talking about stocks, about companies that were about to take off, about mergers and acquisitions. I heard them celebrating big wins and complaining about missed opportunities, and I started to wonder, if they could do it, why couldn't I?" Richard was shaking his head in disbelief. "You expect us to believe you became some kind of stock market genius while pushing a mop?" Thomas turned to him calmly. "I don't expect you to believe anything, Richard. I'm simply telling you what happened. Whether you believe it or not is irrelevant to me." He turned back to Margaret. "I started reading everything I could get my hands on. Financial newspapers, investment books from the library, anything I could find. I learned about compound interest, about dollar cost averaging, about diversification, and I started investing." "How much?" James asked quietly. "How much could you possibly invest on a janitor's salary?" "At first, $50 a month," Thomas said. "That's all I could spare. $50 a month into an index fund. It doesn't sound like much, does it? But that was in 1972, over 50 years ago." He pulled out another document from his folder, a financial statement. $50 a month, every month, without fail. When I got raises, I increased my investment. When I heard about a company that was about to do something big, I'd research it thoroughly, and if it made sense, I'd invest a little more." The paper he held showed a portfolio summary. Margaret caught glimpses of numbers that made her head spin. 7 figures, multiple 7 figures. "I also started buying real estate," Thomas continued. "Small properties at first. A condo here, a duplex there. I'd rent them out, use the income to pay down the mortgages and buy more. I learned about property management, about market trends, about gentrification patterns." Victoria found her voice again, though it came out as a croak. This is insane. You're telling us you became a millionaire while working as a janitor? Multimillionaire, actually, Thomas said mildly. Though I've never been one to brag about such things. The room erupted in murmurs. People were pulling out phones, probably trying to look up property records or verify his claims. Margaret just stared at her father like she'd never seen him before. But why? She asked, her voice breaking. Why did you keep it secret? Why did we live in that tiny apartment? Why did you keep working that job? Why didn't you tell me? Thomas reached over and took her hand. His skin was papery and thin, but his grip was firm. Because I wanted you to grow up with the right values, sweetheart. I wanted you to understand the value of hard work, of humility, of not judging people by their bank accounts or their job titles. He glanced at the Montgomerys, his meaning clear. If I'd raised you in a mansion, sent you to expensive private schools, bought you everything you wanted, would you be the woman you are today? Would you be kind and compassionate and humble? Or would you be like... He trailed off diplomatically, but everyone knew what he meant. Margaret was sobbing openly now, and James was crying too. The whole room seemed to be in some kind of collective shock. Every extra dollar I earned went into investments, Thomas continued. Every bonus, every tax refund, every penny I could spare. I lived in that small apartment because it was all we needed. I drove that old car because it got me where I needed to go. I wore the same suits because they still fit and there was no reason to buy new ones. He smiled, his eyes twinkling. The funny thing about wealth is that once you have enough of it, it starts to grow on its own. Compound interest really is the eighth wonder of the world. My investments paid dividends, which I reinvested. My rental properties increased in value. And I just kept working, kept saving, kept building for your future. But the house, James said, still holding the deed like it might disappear. Why buy a house now? Why not years ago? Thomas's expression grew more serious. Because I wanted to wait until I knew you'd found the right person. Someone who loved you for who you are, not what you have. Someone who'd stand by you even when his own parents were cruel. James flushed, understanding the implied criticism of his inaction. The music started, and everyone took their seats. Margaret's heart pounded as she stood at the back of the ballroom, her arm linked through Lisa's. She'd made the decision weeks ago not to have her father walk her down the aisle. Not because she didn't want him to, but because she couldn't bear the thought of the Montgomerys whispering and snickering as he slowly made his way with his cane. It was a decision that had broken her heart and his, though Thomas had tried to hide it. Whatever makes you comfortable, sweetheart, he'd said when she'd explained her reasoning. But she'd seen the pain in his eyes, and it had haunted her ever since. Now, as the wedding march began, she walked alone down that aisle with Lisa beside her. Her eyes found James at the altar, looking handsome in his tuxedo, his face full of love. But then her gaze shifted to the front row where her father sat, and she saw tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. He was smiling, but she knew him well enough to see the hurt underneath. On the other side, Victoria and Richard sat with perfect posture, their expressions carefully neutral. But Margaret had caught the satisfied look Victoria had given her husband when she'd started walking alone. They'd probably assumed Thomas wasn't capable of walking her down the aisle, another mark against the bride's unfortunate background. The ceremony itself was beautiful. The officiant spoke about love and commitment, about two families coming together. Margaret and James exchanged their vows, their voices steady despite their emotions. When James said, "I do," his eyes never left Margaret's face, and in that moment she remembered why she was doing all of this. Because she loved him. Because he was worth it. They kissed, everyone applauded, and suddenly they were married. Husband and wife. The hard part was over, Margaret thought. Or so she hoped. The reception began immediately after, and that's when things really started to shift. The ballroom had been transformed with tables arranged around a dance floor, a DJ booth in the corner, and a long table for gifts near the entrance. The bar was open, and people began mingling. Thomas made his way slowly to his assigned table, where Margaret's aunt, uncle, and cousins were already seated. They greeted him warmly, pulling out his chair and making sure he was comfortable. This was family. These were his people. Meanwhile, at the head table, Victoria was already holding court. She'd positioned herself where she could see most of the room, and she was doing what she did best, performing. Her laugh was too loud, her gestures too dramatic. Everything about her screamed, "Look at me, see how important I am." Richard stood near the bar with a group of his golf buddies already on his second drink. They were all successful businessmen, the kind who wore their wealth like armor. Their conversation drifted from stocks to real estate to complaining about taxes. "Beautiful wedding," one of them said. "Though I heard the bride's family is, well, not quite our caliber." Richard finished laughing. "That's putting it mildly. Her father cleaned bathrooms for a living. Can you imagine? James could have had his pick of any girl, and he chooses someone whose family tree includes janitors and cashiers." The men laughed, though a few looked uncomfortable. One of them changed the subject, but Richard wasn't done yet. He was on a roll, emboldened by champagne and the satisfaction of putting others down. Across the room, James was trying to make conversation with Margaret's family. He genuinely liked them. They were warm and real in a way his own family had never been. Margaret's Aunt Jennifer was telling a funny story about Margaret as a child, and James laughed along, grateful for the normalcy. But he kept glancing toward his parents, anxiety building in his chest. He knew them too well. The drinks would flow, their inhibitions would drop, and their true nature would come out even more than it already had. The dinner service began, and waiters moved efficiently through the room with plates of food. The meal was expensive, catered by one of the city's top restaurants. Another thing the Montgomerys had insisted on and held over everyone's heads. Thomas ate quietly at his table, responding when spoken to, but mostly just observing. He'd become good at that over the years, watching, listening, understanding situations before acting. His eyes tracked the room, noting how the two sides of the wedding barely interacted, like oil and water refusing to mix. Victoria, meanwhile, was getting progressively louder. She'd switched from champagne to white wine and was on her third glass. Her voice carried across the ballroom as she described their recent Mediterranean cruise to a captive audience. "The service was impeccable," she announced. "Though you do have to tip generously to get the staff to really take care of you. Not that everyone understands the importance of proper tipping." Her eyes cut briefly toward the bride's side of the room. One of her friends leaned in. "Victoria, dear, you've outdone yourself with this wedding. Everything is so elegant." "Well, someone had to ensure it was done properly," Victoria said, her voice dripping with meaning. "Left to their own devices, who knows what we would have ended up with? Probably some backyard barbecue affair." Margaret heard this from the head table, and her hand tightened around her fork. James reached over and squeezed her knee under the table. "Ignore her," he whispered. "Please." "Your mother is making this very difficult," Margaret whispered back, her eyes stinging. "I know. I'm sorry." "I'm so sorry." After dinner, the DJ announced it was time for the traditional dances. First, the bride and groom's dance. Margaret and James moved to the floor, and everyone watched as they swayed to their chosen song. For a few minutes, Margaret forgot about everything else. It was just her and James, the man she loved, starting their life together. But then came the father-daughter dance. The DJ called for it, and Margaret felt her stomach drop. She looked toward her father's table, and Thomas was already standing, reaching for his cane. The room grew quieter, and Margaret could feel eyes on them. Judging eyes. As Thomas made his way slowly to the dance floor, Richard's voice carried from the bar area. "This should be interesting. Hope he doesn't throw out his back." A few people laughed. Thomas heard it but kept moving forward, his face impassive. When he reached Margaret, she was crying, though she tried to smile. "You don't have to do this, Dad," she whispered. "If it's too hard." "Sweetheart," he interrupted gently, "I've waited my whole life to dance with you at your wedding. A little pain is nothing." The music started, something slow and sweet, and Thomas set his cane aside. He took his daughter's hand and placed his other hand on her waist, and they began to move. His steps were slow and careful, but there was a grace to them, a dignity that silenced the mockery. Margaret laid her head on her father's shoulder and let the tears flow freely. "I love you so much, Dad. I'm so sorry they're treating you this way." "Hush now," Thomas said softly. "This is your day. Don't let them take that from you. And don't you worry about me. I've dealt with far worse than the Montgomerys. But you don't deserve what I deserve or don't deserve isn't the point," he said, his voice still gentle but firm. "The point is that I raised a daughter who has compassion, who sees people for who they are rather than what they have. That makes me richer than all of them combined." As they danced, some of the guests from the bride's side watched with tears in their eyes. They knew Thomas's story. knew how hard he'd worked, how much he'd sacrificed. They saw the love between father and daughter, and it moved them. But Victoria, watching from her table, just looked bored. She leaned over to her husband. Well, at least it's almost over. Soon we can give our gift and show everyone what real generosity looks like. When the dance ended, Margaret hugged her father tightly. Thank you, she whispered. Always, sweetheart, always. Thomas returned to his seat and the party continued. More dancing, more drinking, more mingling. The night was wearing on and Margaret had begun to relax slightly. Maybe they'd make it through this without any more incidents. Maybe everything would be okay. But then the DJ tapped his microphone and announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, it's now time for the presentation of gifts." Margaret's stomach dropped again. She'd forgotten about this part. The Montgomerys had insisted on a public gift presentation. They wanted everyone to see how generous they were being. Richard stood first, straightening his jacket and walking to the center of the room with Victoria beside him. They looked like they were about to accept an award rather than give a gift. The spotlight literally swung to illuminate them. "James, Margaret," Richard began, his voice booming with self-satisfaction. "Your mother and I wanted to give you something truly special to start your marriage off right." Victoria held up an envelope with a flourish. "We're sending you on a 2-week honeymoon to Bali. First-class flights, a private villa with your own pool, spa treatments, gourmet meals, the works." The room erupted in applause. It was objectively an incredible gift. Probably cost $30,000 or $40,000, Margaret thought numbly. Of course they'd chosen something that expensive, something that would be impossible for anyone else to match. James and Margaret stood and made their way over to accept the envelope and hug his parents. "Thank you so much," James said, though his voice lacked enthusiasm. He knew what this was really about. Victoria kissed her son's cheek, then turned to Margaret with that tight smile. "We hope you enjoy it, dear. It's the kind of vacation you probably never imagined you'd take." The dig landed exactly as intended. Margaret felt her face flush, but she managed to keep smiling. "It's very generous." "Thank you." Other gifts followed. James's aunt and uncle gave them a set of high-end luggage. His college roommate gave them a certificate to an exclusive restaurant that required reservations months in advance. Each gift seemed designed to outdo the last, a competition among the wealthy guests to show who was most generous. Margaret's family had given their gifts privately earlier, knowing they couldn't compete with this kind of display. Her aunt had given them handmade quilts. Her cousin had given them a photo album filled with pictures from throughout Margaret's life. Her uncle had given them a set of tools and offered to help them with any house repairs they might need. Simple gifts. Thoughtful gifts, but nothing that would impress this crowd. Then the DJ said something that made Margaret's blood run cold. And now, a gift from the bride's father, Thomas Chen.